Hey everybody, welcome back to Unit 2. This is Topic 2 tonight. We're talking about developed and developing nations. Now, these are concepts that are really important at the United Nations and indeed in all of the international attempts to approach different kinds of issues, particularly ones that have to do with the standard of living enjoyed by people in particular countries or particular parts of the world. They're not fixed terms. Now, that's not to say they wouldn't be if you went and took, for example, a politics of development class or sociology of development class, even a geography of development class, where there would be a fixed definition of the states that have achieved certain means and states that haven't. The problem at the United Nations is that different UN bodies have different definitions, different ways of handling the concepts. So what you say this is a developed or developing state in one body may be different than the standard they have in another body. It reminds me of an assignment I had as an undergrad where we were asked to write what were called historical definitions, where in this history class we were given concepts that were pretty commonly used. For example, traditional was one of the words I remember very clearly, and asked to define the words not based on how they were described in a dictionary, but how they were used in articles and books. So I think we had four of each we were supposed to look at and then define in an essay what traditional meant. And what we found pretty quickly was all the different authors agreed that traditional meant sometime before now, but they didn't really agree on when before now they meant, which made it problematic for us because we didn't want to use the word traditional because it was vague. On the other hand, we had no other word to really talk about this time before now when things were different, before something changed. That's a weird way to describe it, but we had to keep using it. And I think what you'll find when we go through what developed and developing are that we don't have a fixed definition, but we're going to have to use the phrases anyway in developed and developing. Anyway, let us launch. So, the UNDP is the UN Development Program, and it is the main branch of the UN that is looking to help states improve their standard of living. They have not a definition, but they have a place where they work or places where they work and projects that they're working on. So if they work in 170 countries, then it might suggest that the other 23 are places where their help is not needed. So it might be one way to define developed and developing is if states have a certain standard of living, certain lifestyles, and certain sort of human capital that they are developed because the UNDP doesn't have to be there. But the UNDP doesn't say that flat out. It's just a suggestion. One thing you could do is look at a major report that the UNDP puts out each year. It's called the Human Development Index, and so this is something that looks at three measures. A long and healthy life, that's a goal that we through the UNDP have for all people. Knowledge is a goal that they have for all people, and a decent standard of living. So those three goals together, they have indices and measures they try and look at for those three things, and that feeds into something called the Human Development Index. So what you would see is the darkest green on this map. So if you look on your right, you would see in the sort of the Asian or Oceanic Asian theater, four countries. There in the dark green, there would be South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, several European states, and then the United States and Canada as being in this darkest green color. Those would be those would be in the highest level of the Human Development Index because are measures of a long and healthy life, of aggregate knowledge and or human capital, and a decent standard of living are the highest. And it runs on a scale all the way to the darkest red. There are a couple of places that are gray where you don't have data. Greenland is one. It's actually a province of Denmark, so there's not enough people there to get an effective measure. And the other is way up over here. It's North Korea, and that's mostly because there's no reliable data. And so if you have an index that's based on data, it's hard to say that they don't have it. You see that Somalia is the same way, and then there's this little place called Western Sahara over here that has a long, interesting, and complicated history. And if you want to chat about it, shoot me an email, and we'll go for it. So one way you could do the measure of developed and developing would be the states who are in the best shape on the Human Development Index, but that would omit places like France and Italy, which are some of the stronger states in the world and certainly consider themselves developed. So maybe that's not as effective a measure as we can get. So let's try another one. Let's look at the UN budget. This is something that probably would have been useful to expand upon in Unit 1. We did mention in Unit 1 that the United States provides 22% of the budget. There was an international agreement reached several years ago at the UN that 22% would be the maximum that any country would contribute. So even if and when we have a GDP that is larger than 22% of the global share, we won't be required to pay more than 22%. So we pay $611 million to the general budget. There's some other budgetary things that happen. There's a peacekeeping budget that's separate. There's food levies and emergency response programs that are separate. We pay 22%, is about $611 million. The top 20 countries in the world, the G20, which we'll look at in a few minutes, they pay overall 84% of the UN budget, which leaves 16% for the other 173 countries. In fact, 31 countries contribute less to the UN because their share of the global GDP is 0.001% or less. In fact, 0.001 is the minimum that any country will be required to pay, even though some may have even a smaller share of the global GDP. That's about $25,000. And I would imagine that there are several people who will take this class who've had a larger annual income than $25,000, but that's all they pay to get all the services back from the United Nations. So you would say, okay, what if the top 20 are developed and the rest are developing? Well, I'm going to skip 2 slides. I might have these a little out of order from what I want to do. Let's go to this. So if the size of the economy is the measure, and the 20 that are over there paying the 84% are the measure, developed and developing, then let's consider that. So the G20 countries, this is an organization, an IGO called the G20. It meets regularly to talk about macroeconomic issues. 10 of the states on the G20 are actually developing states, or considered developing states based on the HDI, the Human Development Index, or based on other measures in, for example, the World Trade Organization, in the International Monetary Fund, or some other places. So that would include China and Mexico and Brazil, and which all have top 10 economies in the world. So you might not think that a developing state would also be one that has one of the largest economies in the world. So that becomes problematic. So if it's HDI plus income plus something, or maybe it's not. So let's back up to the UN, to the HDI. So look at this list of the G20, and then look at, so notice, for example, that New Zealand is missing, and Iceland is missing, and the Sweden and Norway are missing. But if you look here, those states are in the darkest green as the most developed. Their economies just don't happen to be as good. Because remember, the HDI measures a decent standard of living. It doesn't say you have to be the richest. And if you want to look through to the HDI, you'll see what they might mean by decent standard of living and knowledge, etc. So the main point of this discussion is, should there be special considerations for certain kinds of states over others? And typically that comes down to a conversation of developed and developing. For example, in 1994, when the Kyoto Protocol negotiations regarding the emission of greenhouse gases were underway, one of the main points of consideration was, should the states that were developing be given more time to comply with the requirements that were going to be placed in Kyoto than the states that were developed? And some people thought, sure, that seems like a good idea, but what they were really talking about typically were the states that are in these dark colors, these dark reds, or the yellows, perhaps, not competitors. But if you go back to this list, then you see you have these G20 states. If you gave them, these states, some special considerations, you're actually giving your direct economic competitors special considerations, not just poor states or developing states. See, this is where the concept becomes problematic. Is China is a developing state, and so is Chad. And so if you go to this little list here, Djibouti, Marshall Islands, and Somalia, those are developing states. If you go to this list here, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Russia, Saudi Arabia, those are developing states too. And the problem is you can't really compare those two kinds of states. They don't function the same way, they don't act the same way, but they certainly do fall short on the GNI of the other states. So, how does it come together? And the question is imperfectly and awkwardly. It's one of the reasons why we never joined Kyoto. We signed the Kyoto Protocol, the United States signed it, but as you may remember from last unit, signing something is an indication of support, but it does not bind you. You have to ratify it. And it was never ratified in the United States. In fact, it was estimated that 98 out of the 100 U.S. senators would have voted no. And the issue was primarily granting special considerations to your direct competitor in China, Russia, etc. Well, maybe it's more useful then to look at a place like the UN Office of the High Representative on Landlocked and Developing States. So these may be the states you're really thinking of when you're talking about states that need special considerations, would be landlocked developing states or small island developing states. So these are places that have some sort of disadvantage when it comes to shocks to the system. For example, in the United States and other states that measure high on the HDI or who have big economies, if you have a downturn in one part of your economy, it may impact your overall economic health, but not as much as in a smaller state where the product of your economy is typically one thing. And so if that one thing has a shock, then you're in real trouble. It might also be the difference. I'm recording this right after Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria swept through both the United States and through the Caribbean. And so there are small Caribbean states who are islands. They're SIDS, this group here, Small Island Developing States, where the impact of that hurricane is essentially devastating, not just to a region, but to the entire country. I remember when Hurricane Mitch came through in the late 90s, and it basically parked itself over Honduras. They talked about Honduras having an impact on their economy that would last 50 years. And here, in a larger state, which is more able to handle shocks like the United States, we can move resources from around the country to help out the areas that are hard hit. So those advantages. Landlocked states tend to have particularly economic disadvantages, not being able to border on the sea. It's one of the reasons why those states were excited, like I talked about in the last lecture, where there's some heritage of mankind spots, for example, in the high seas, deep oceans, and places like that. They have particular disadvantages, so the UN office on these countries does particular work for them. The poorest of the poor are called least developed countries, or LDCs. These might more be the states you're thinking of and I think of when you say developing states, instead of China, India, and Indonesia, or Mexico or Brazil, which have really powerful economies. But they're the ones who get particular kinds of aid. So if we go back to this list before we end, these are the kind of considerations you'd consider. With Kyoto, it was additional time to comply. Other times there might be kinds of aids. Those of you who receive financial aid know there's a difference between a grant and a loan, and different kinds of loans, subsidized loans versus unsubsidized loans. And so maybe to the poorest of the poor states, you give different kinds of aid, grants through the UNDP instead of loans from the IMF. Maybe there'll be technology transfers or trade considerations. The LDCs, for example, have access, duty-free access to the European Union for their goods that other developing states don't have. Patent exemptions, if you need to get access to, for example, antiretroviral drugs to help treat someone who has HIV, then there could be patent exemptions to let you not develop, but to produce your own drugs and not have to trade for them. So these are kinds of considerations that we want to collectively in the international system give to developing states. We're just not quite sure who all the developing states are because of all these differences we've just talked about. So let's switch back to this. Here we are. We've got these phrases, developed and developing. There's LDCs, and there's a short video for you to watch in this unit to see what an LDC is. But beyond that, we're not entirely sure what to do with this phrase. We kind of recognize the shortcomings of a developing state when we see them. You might be able to do it in comparison to the developed states such as the United States and Norway and Australia and Japan, but it would be useful to have a fixed measure. We don't have a fixed measure. And that's problematic in terms of knowing what's developed and what's developing. So we don't know exactly what it means, but we're going to use the phrase over